Indonesia is a powerhouse in Southeast Asia, with a massive economy and a huge population. It's one of the fastest-growing countries in the world, with an average growth rate of almost 5% per year since 2000, and an expected GDP growth rate of 4.8% in 2023. That's quite impressive, right? But there's a catch. Behind this amazing growth, there are some serious problems that many people don't see or talk about. Problems like corruption, inequality, environmental damage, and human rights abuse. This is the dark side of Indonesia's economic rise. Looking at Indonesia's remarkable economic growth, one might think that Indonesia is a democracy with a clean and transparent government. Unfortunately, this is far from the truth. Indonesia is actually one of the most corrupt countries in the world. According to the 2022 Corruption Perceptions Index by Transparency International, Indonesia ranked 110th out of 180 countries and territories in terms of perceived levels of public sector corruption. Indonesia scored 34 out of 100 on the CPI scale, where 0 means highly corrupt and 100 means very clean. This score indicates that Indonesia has a high level of corruption and a low level of anti-corruption efforts. Indonesia's score has not improved much since 2014, when it scored 34 out of 100. That means it's worse than countries like Brazil and Mexico. Corruption is everywhere in Indonesia, from the highest levels of power to the lowest levels of society. It costs the country billions of dollars every year and undermines its development and democracy. Here are 3 examples of how bad corruption is in Indonesia. First, we have the social aid embezzlement case. This was a corruption case that involved the embezzlement of more than $40 million from the state budget allocated for social aid programs for poor and vulnerable people affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The case implicated several officials from the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Social Security Agency. The case also revealed the involvement of several private companies and individuals who acted as accomplices or beneficiaries of the embezzlement scheme. The KPK arrested and charged 12 suspects in this case in February 2023. Second is the regional election bribery case. This was a corruption case that involved the bribery of members of the Regional Representative Council to influence the outcome of the regional elections held in December 2022. The case implicated several candidates for governor, mayor, or regent who paid bribes to DPD members to secure their endorsement or support. The case also revealed the involvement of several intermediaries and facilitators who arranged or delivered the bribes. The KPK arrested and charged 18 suspects in this case in March 2023. And finally, the COVID vaccine procurement case. This was a corruption case that involved the alleged markup of prices and kickbacks in the procurement of COVID-19 vaccines from China's Sinovac Biotech. The case implicated several officials from the Ministry of Health and the state-owned pharmaceutical company PT Biopharma. The case also revealed the involvement of several intermediaries and brokers who received commissions from the vaccine deal. The Corruption Eradication Commission arrested and charged 6 suspects in this case in January 2023. These are just some of the examples of corruption in Indonesia. There are many more that we don't have time to cover in this video, but you get the idea. Corruption is a huge problem in Indonesia that affects its economy, its society, and its people. And it's not going away anytime soon. It's easy to think that Indonesia's economic growth is good for everyone, that it lifts people out of poverty and creates a more prosperous and equal society. Unfortunately, that's also not quite the case. Indonesia is actually one of the most unequal countries in the world, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. In this part of the video, we're going to show you how bad inequality is in Indonesia and what causes it. Let's start with some numbers. The World Bank says that Indonesia is the 4th most unequal country in the world when it comes to income distribution. That means there's a huge gap between how much money people make and how much money people have. The Gini coefficient, which measures this gap on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 means everyone has the same income and 100 means one person has all the income, went up from 30 in 2000 to 38 last year for Indonesia. That's a big increase in just 2 decades. But what does that mean in real life? Well, it means that the 4 richest men in Indonesia have more money than the bottom 100 million people combined, according to Oxfam. That's right, 4 guys have more wealth than half of the country's population. And the richest 1% of Indonesians own almost half of the country's wealth, whilst the poorest 10% own less than 1%. And guess what? The wealth of the richest 1% increased by $21 billion in 2019, which is enough to end extreme poverty in Indonesia 4 times over. So, how did this happen? How did Indonesia become so unequal? Well, there are many factors that contribute to this problem, but here are 3 of the main ones. Firstly, we have tax evasion. This is when wealthy people or companies don't pay their fair share of taxes or hide their money from the government. This means that the government loses billions of dollars every year that could be used for public services and social programs that help the poor and vulnerable. For example, in 2015, Indonesia lost an estimated $6.5 billion in tax revenue due to illegal money transfers or tax avoidance by rich individuals or corporations, according to Global Financial Integrity. Secondly, land grabbing. This is when large corporations or investors take over land from small farmers or indigenous communities without their consent or compensation. This means that millions of people lose their homes, their livelihoods, their natural resources, and their rights. For example, in the past decade, Indonesia has experienced a massive transfer of land from small farmers and indigenous communities to large corporations and investors, resulting in land conflicts, displacement, environmental damage, and human rights violations, according to Consortium Pembaruan Agraria. And thirdly, discrimination. This is when groups of people are treated unfairly or differently based on their ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or other characteristics. This means that millions of people face barriers or challenges in accessing opportunities, resources, services, and rights that others enjoy. For example, in Indonesia, there are various forms of discrimination that affect different groups of people, such as ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, children, LGBT people, and so on. These groups often face violence, harassment, intimidation, or persecution because of who they are or what they believe in, according to Human Rights Watch. These are just some of the many examples of inequality that plague Indonesia's society and economy. Inequality not only affects the quality of life and well-being of millions of Indonesians, but also threatens the sustainability and stability of the country's growth and progress. Many people think that Indonesia's economic growth is good for the environment, that it creates more jobs, more income, and more development. And this is where our third problem comes to play: environmental degradation. Indonesia is actually one of the worst countries in the world when it comes to environmental health and protection. In this part of the video, we're going to show you how bad environmental degradation is in Indonesia and what causes it. Yale University says that Indonesia is the 137th worst country out of 180 countries in terms of environmental performance. That means that Indonesia has a low level of environmental quality and a high level of environmental damage. The Environmental Performance Index, which measures this on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 means worst and 100 means best, gave Indonesia a score of 44.5 in 2020. That's a poor score that hasn't improved much in the last decade. But what does that mean in real life? Well, it means that Indonesia has many environmental problems that affect its people and nature. Let's take a look at 3 of the main ones. Number 1. Deforestation. This is when trees are cut down or burned for various purposes, such as making palm oil, paper, or mining. This means that Indonesia loses a lot of forest land every year, which is bad for the environment and the climate. For example, in 2020, Indonesia lost 115,459 hectares of forest land, which is about the size of Los Angeles, according to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. Deforestation reduces the ability of forests to store carbon and prevent global warming. Deforestation also threatens the wildlife and ecosystems that live in forests, such as orangutans, tigers, and elephants. Number 2. Forest fires. This is when forests catch fire due to natural or human causes, such as lightning or land clearing. This means that Indonesia has a lot of fire alerts every year, which is bad for the air and the health. For example, in 2020, Indonesia had 4.3 million hectares of fire alerts, which is larger than Switzerland, according to Global Forest Watch. Forest fires produce haze and smoke that affect millions of people in Indonesia and neighboring countries, such as Singapore and Malaysia. Forest fires also release a lot of carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the atmosphere, which worsen global warming and acid rain. Number 3. Water pollution. This is when water sources are contaminated by various substances, such as waste, chemicals, or oil. This means that Indonesia has a lot of polluted water every year, which is bad for the water and life. For example, only 7% of Indonesia's rivers have good water quality, while 82% are polluted and 11% are heavily polluted, according to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. Water pollution affects the availability and quality of water for drinking, farming, washing, etc. Water pollution also harms aquatic life and ecosystems that depend on water resources. These are just some of the many examples of environmental degradation that plague Indonesia's environment and economy. Environmental degradation not only affects the quality of life and well-being of millions of Indonesians, but also threatens the sustainability and stability of the country's growth and progress. Human rights violations are another major problem that Indonesia faces as a result of its economic rise. According to the 2020 Human Rights Report by Amnesty International, Indonesia had a poor record of upholding human rights and respecting international human rights law and standards. The report documented numerous cases of human rights abuses or issues that Indonesia faced in 2020. Let's take a look at the 3 main points. First, we have unlawful or arbitrary killings by government security forces. The report stated that security forces were responsible for at least 96 unlawful killings in Papua and West Papua provinces, where a long-standing armed conflict between the government and separatist groups continued. The victims included at least 25 civilians and 19 children. The report also stated that security forces used excessive force and firearms to disperse peaceful protests in various parts of the country, resulting in at least 10 deaths and hundreds of injuries. Next, torture and other ill treatment by police. The report stated that police routinely used torture and other ill treatment to extract confessions or punish suspects or detainees. The report documented several cases of torture and other ill treatment by police, such as beating, kicking, electrocuting, burning, or shooting with rubber bullets. The report also stated that police often failed to respect the rights of suspects or detainees to legal counsel, medical care, or family visits. Lastly, arbitrary arrest or detention. The report stated that police arbitrarily arrested or detained hundreds of people for exercising their rights to freedom of expression, assembly, and association. The report documented several cases of arbitrary arrest or detention by police, such as arresting or detaining peaceful protesters, journalists, activists, lawyers, religious figures, or political opponents on vague or fabricated charges. The report also stated that police often held people in prolonged pretrial detention without judicial review or oversight. As we have seen in this video, Indonesia's economic rise has a dark side that poses many challenges and risks for the country and its people. Corruption, Inequality, environmental degradation, and human rights violations are just some of the major problems that Indonesia faces as a result of its rapid development. These problems not only affect the quality of life and well-being of millions of Indonesians, but also threaten the sustainability and stability of the country's growth and progress.